We write the 29th of June, 1971, 200 kilometers above the Earth's surface in space. Three cosmonauts are experiencing the last minutes of their lives. They have spent 22 days on the Salyut 1 space station, the world's first space station. But now their mission is over, and they are to return to Earth. The Soyuz 11 spacecraft detaches from the station and initiates re-entry into the atmosphere. They connect via radio with ground control, discuss the weather data in the targeted landing area, and everything looks good. The braking rockets ignite as planned, but suddenly there is no more message from the cosmonauts. Ground control hears nothing, and it becomes silent around the crew. Intermittently, the radio connection cuts off as scheduled, but even when the capsule comes back within radio range, the ground station receives no messages from the crew. 20 minutes later, at 23:16, the capsule lands automatically, 200 kilometers east of Zhezkazgan in Kazakhstan. When the recovery team opens the hatch 2 minutes later, their worst fear is confirmed. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev hang lifeless in their seats. Attempts at resuscitation remain unsuccessful. For the first time in the history of space research, people have died in space. But what happened? How did the three cosmonauts die? And what actually happens if I die in space without a spacesuit? How many people have already died in space, and what laws must be observed concerning a death in space? There have not been many spacecraft accidents in which people have died, fortunately. As of now, a total of 19 people have lost their lives on space missions. The last major tragedy with human victims occurred on February 1st, 2003, well over 20 years ago. Back then, the 7 crew members of NASA's Space Shuttle Columbia lost their lives. On the return from a 2-week mission, the capsule broke apart 65 kilometers above the ground, and the remnants of the space shuttle were scattered across Texas and Louisiana in the USA. The cause of the incident was already present at the launch from Earth. A piece of insulation from the fuel tank had come loose and, upon falling, caused minor damage to the left wing of the shuttle, which can be seen quite well in this footage from NASA. At this point, upon re-entry into the atmosphere, 1,800-degree hot gases were able to penetrate into the wing and damage it so severely that the entire spacecraft became unstable. The occupants had just 40 seconds to react to the catastrophe. 1 wore no helmet, 3, no gloves. The pressure chamber decompressed and no one survived. However, the crew did not die in space, but 65 kilometers above the ocean surface. But from what height does space actually begin? There isn't really a uniform definition of exactly where space begins. It's also not so easy to determine because our atmosphere doesn't abruptly end at some point, but becomes thinner and thinner as the distance from the Earth's surface increases. Therefore, there is mostly agreement on a number. 100 kilometers above sea level is the Kármán line. Approximately from here, the atmosphere is so thin that it can no longer be used to fly with wings or rotors. Anything that is to climb so high or higher must thus be built with space travel technologies, and not only function like an airplane or helicopter. If one adheres to this definition, the 3 Soviet cosmonauts from the Soyuz 11 capsule are the first and only people to have ever died in space, as their misfortune occurred another 100 kilometers above the Kármán line. The Columbia disaster happened 35 kilometers below it, and all other space travel disasters with fatalities occurred below the Kármán line. But before we look at exactly how the 3 cosmonauts died and what happened to them afterward, we want to answer another question. Namely, what happens to your body if it dies in space, completely without the protection of a spacesuit? Let's assume we would land in space without a protective suit. If we were still alive, we would quickly lose consciousness and then suffocate as there is no air to breathe. But then there is also the vacuum of space, so there is no air pressure here as there is down on Earth. Therefore, some physical processes work a little differently here. For example, water boils faster the less air pressure is available, and because there is a lot of water in our blood, Our body, so to speak, becomes a cooking pot. Bubbles from the water vapor in the blood would form and lead to occlusion of the vessels. In the worst case, our eyes could even burst. And if there was still air in the lungs, they could rupture. So holding your breath is not such a good idea. In 1966, NASA test person Jim LeBlanc got a taste of what this can feel like. He tested the current spacesuit in a vacuum chamber, but this suit had a hole. After only 14 seconds, he lost consciousness, but he noticed beforehand how the water on his tongue began to boil. Fortunately, he survived, but if we were to die in space, our body wouldn't decompose and decay as it would on Earth, because these processes require oxygen. Instead, we might become a kind of space mummy after all our bodily fluids have evaporated. And since we don't have Earth's atmosphere to protect us from the harmful radiation of the sun, we would get the ultimate sunburn. But the idea that one could be instantly shock frozen, as depicted in some films, is rather unrealistic. For our body to lose its heat totally quickly to the surroundings is not so simple in the vacuum, but happens relatively slowly. Eventually, however, one would still be deep frozen and glide through the solar system in this way, well, until we burn up in the atmosphere of a planet as a shooting star or plunge into the sun. Thankfully, such a thing has never happened to a human. But what protocols actually exist should a person die in space, for example, on a space station or on a months-long journey to Mars? How would the corpse be disposed of, and what laws apply in space at all? For such questions, the United Nations established the so-called Outer Space Treaty 60 years ago. Among other things, it stipulates that the laws of the country that registered a spacecraft apply on board. And depending on what is required in this country after the death of a person, it would probably also have to be implemented in space, quite similar to ships on the high seas. Either way, the deceased would still have to be buried. But that's not so simple in space. Digging a grave is not possible, but could the body just be dumped in space? No, that's actually prohibited. The United Nations has established fairly strict rules on how we can keep Earth's orbit as clean as possible. That works extremely well so far, haha, and such a dead body would be at least a collision risk for satellites and the like. Therefore, a research group has developed a proposal on how to handle the death of a crew member step by step, because a corpse aboard a closed system like a spaceship is a contamination risk, and this method is called body bag. First, the corpse is placed in a kind of airtight sleeping bag and exposed to the conditions of space for an hour. Thus, the dead person is slowly freeze-dried. Subsequently, a machine shakes them for so long and so strongly that the body disintegrates into dust. If there is still residual moisture contained in this dust, it is dried with microwave radiation. This powder could then be stored relatively safely until the crew flies back to Earth. There, the family of the deceased person receives the remains. However, since there are no official rules for dealing with the death of crew members in space, in case of doubt, the highest-ranking person on board determines what should happen to the body. Such a rule has not yet had to be established because all astronauts and cosmonauts who died on space missions burned or exploded with their spaceship, except for the 3 cosmonauts of Soyuz 11. And what happened to them, we'll look at now. So, what happened to the crew of Soyuz 11? The team on Earth did not know at first what had happened to the crew. However, they had not heard anything from the cosmonauts for some time, and that was actually planned differently. So something must have gone wrong. And indeed, when the braking rockets were ignited, a balancing valve opened. All breathable air escaped from the landing capsule, and the 3 occupants suffocated. The landing then happened fully automatically. When the recovery forces opened the capsule, all resuscitation attempts came too late. However, Dobrovolsky, Vladislav, and Patsayev received a joint state funeral and were buried in the Cemetery of Honor in Moscow. And at the place where the Soyuz landed back then, a memorial stands today. So anyone who dies in space is buried according to the laws of the country that operates the spaceship they are traveling in. Whether I would now personally like to be freeze-dried and crumbled into dust crumbs by the body back method, I don't know exactly, but it raises a few interesting questions. What will happen to the first people who will die on the way to Mars or on Mars? Will the first spacecraft flying there already have cremation and burial facilities on board? What do you think? Would you fly to the Moon or Mars if you got the chance? And if you die on the mission, how would you like to be buried? You can tell me in the comments and leave a rating for the video if you'd like to support me.